Hello and welcome everyone to this video in which we'll be discussing a reading comprehension passage from CAT 2024 slot 2. And in this video, we're going to be reading the passage and understanding what information are we supposed to take away from the passage immediately after finishing reading it for the first time. So first sentence of the passage sets a very nice precedent of what might be the main topic of discussion. It says that history of any major technological or industrial advance is inevitably shadowed. Shadowed means the shadow comes after. The first comes the object, then comes the shadow. So the meaning of the word shadowed, if you can understand, if you know, then that greatly helps in understanding the point that the author is trying to make. Shadowed by a less predictable history of unintended consequences and secondary effects. So an invention is made with an intent, and then behind it comes a secondary effect which was not intended. So for that, the author is giving us the example of Gutenberg, and the next paragraph is telling us that what kind of secondary effects can actually take place because of the invention. So first example that is giving us is a secondary effect that seems to belong to an entirely different sphere of society. So the secondary effect is affecting a different sphere of society. Next paragraph, he's talking about how that secondary effect happens because consumers use the invention in a surprising way or in a different way than as compared to what it was intended as. And then the third example that the author is giving is that the original invention came into the world disguised as a plaything. So it was a plaything, but it was actually a path-breaking invention, which later on, as a secondary effect, actually impacted our lives very greatly. So he is giving us in this passage three different ways in which the secondary effects can happen after the primary invention has been made. And very nice, interesting read. The kind of examples that he's giving the example of carrier AC, how that was particularly intended for factories, but then led to entire cities being established because of ACs coming into the picture. Then he's giving us the example of the phonograph and how that led to revolution of the music industry because people, instead of using it for dictation that it was intended to be used for, people started using it for music. So very nice stories. I think it's a very nice passage, very interesting passage to read till this paragraph. And then comes the last three paragraphs, which suddenly changes the topic of discussion almost entirely. I would say that till here, till this point, the passages are about secondary inventions only. From here, the author transitions the secondary inventions, particularly to talk about pollution and climate change. Because climate change is also an unintended secondary consequence of things that have happened since the time of industrial revolution. And then the rest of the passage, the author is completely focusing upon climate change and how did it happen, when did it happen, what led to it being happening, and why secondary effects like that are likely to happen a lot. So this passage is the story of two halves. One half is about secondary effects of inventions in general. Second half is about how climate change and global warming and pollution is a secondary effect of industrial revolution and how all or what all factors led to that happening and how the author believes that a lot of those things we saw it coming and some things like that will continue happening. That's what the author is saying in the last paragraph. So it's like two different RC passages being put into one. So we cannot pinpoint whether the main topic of discussion is secondary unintended consequences, or is it that the author is trying to use secondary unintended consequence as a instrument to segue into talking about climate change and global warming and pollution. So both of these are equally important as part of the main topic of discussion. If I were to define the main topic of the passage, I would say that the author talks about secondary consequences of inventions and how one of those consequences that is plaguing us in today's day and age is climate change and global warming. So this is what we have to understand from the passage. Now, the things that you have to take away from the passage is that the word count is 503, almost exactly the average word count of most CAT reading comprehension passages. This passage is actually factual. Mostly it is factual. Maybe in the last couple of paragraphs, the author is having a bit of minor opinions about how we could have and should have tackled climate change, how the effects of it was visible very early and we should have acted. But then the author is not giving us directly his perspective or making a very strong argument. Most of the passage, the author is recollecting facts, and that's what makes this passage a simple read despite it being a passage of two different halves. It has been picked up from New York Times, reads like kind of a news article, and that's why it comes to the present times, that because it is coming from a news magazine. So it needs to talk about current affairs, and currently the problem of climate change is more important than talking about historical context of secondary consequences of inventions, and that's why it is a passage of two different halves. I would say because it's a factual passage, interesting to read as well, at least till he starts talking about climate change. From then it becomes a bit dry. but it is also very familiar. We are all very, very familiar with the topic of discussion of climate change. So I would say about 2.5 minutes is enough to read and understand this particular passage. Acceptable time to read is 3 minutes. I think anything more than 3 minutes, 10 seconds, you are fooling yourself. You're trying to understand too much of the passage, or your concentration levels are not enough. Overall difficulty, absolutely simple passage to read, nothing difficult to comprehend. Things to learn, not much, but then I think everyone should be familiar with personalities like Gutenberg, Carrier, and Charles Babbage, very, very famous persons. If you are not familiar with them, find out why they are famous and what all things they invented and how that has affected the quality of life today. Stay tuned for the next video in which I'll be discussing the solutions to the questions of this particular passage. Thank you.